Okay, so medieval and early modern literature. Uh, so, students, we began with some introduction of literature, some introduction of a literary text. From that, we moved on to get some idea of what are the major genres in literature or what are the major types of literary texts. We finished our discussion in the last class. Today, we are going to move on to understand the historical development of English literature. Over here on this slide, what you see is medieval and early modern literature. That is one of the most initial historical stages of English literature. The first question before we move on is, why do we need to know the historical context of the development of literature? The answer to this question is because when we read a literary text, and when we try to analyze a literary text, the reading and analysis of a literary text is possible only when we know what is the time frame in which the text was written. Also, we need to know what is the time frame in which the text is set, and these are two different things. When the literary text was written was the time of the author, right? When the author was born and when he started writing his work or her work. That is the historical context of the author. While the time in which the text has been set, that is the time which, give me a second, please. Okay. Give me a second. Okay. Now, the time in which the text is set, that time is the time in which the writer decides to set the story of a particular book. Okay, so many of you refer to Shakespeare's works, right? Now, Shakespeare's work, of course, were written in the time when Shakespeare was born and when he grew up in England. Okay, and that was roughly part of 15th century and 16th century. That is the time when the work was written. But when you read the text, you get to know that the story inside the plays, the plot inside the plays, that has been set in different other time periods. Okay, sometimes it is the Roman king and queen. Sometimes they are the earlier you know uh, uh, kings and queens of other parts of the world, right? So that is the time when the story is set in. So we need to understand the historical context of a literary text because that helps us to analyze the text in a better way and to understand the text in a better way. Moreover, depending upon a certain time period, there are different issues which appear in the history, and those issues are described in the literary text. If we are not aware of the historical context, we cannot fully understand those issues. For example, in Charles Dickens' works, we find lot of representation of the minor workers, the child labor. And the child labor was a very big moral issue in England of the time when Charles Dickens was writing his works. Similarly, we need to understand the historical context because depending upon the historical context, the mode of expression changes. The way the writers write their work, that changes depending upon the age in which they are writing. So if you compare a short story, or any literary work written very recently, if you compare that with the text which has been written 300 years ago, you will clearly see the difference of the language, right? And I put this point once again to emphasize the idea that even the language changes. Okay, so the language in which the writers wrote 400 years ago is different from the language which is being used these days. That is why we need to understand the historical context to see how the language has changed over the time, how the mode of expression has changed over the time, and how the nature of issues, social issues, has changed over the time. Only then we can better understand a literary text. Now, today we are only going to begin with medieval literature, and then we will go on to early modern literature. Okay, so the medieval literature, to be specific, is ranged between this time period that you can see on the screen, 450 to 1500. Of course, AD, right? Now, the Middle Ages are also called Dark Ages, and the Middle Ages is the beginning of what we call medieval times. If you look at it, medieval time is ranged between 450 to 1500, right? So it's an extensive time period. Now, the initial time period within this medieval, range is called the Middle Ages. They are also called Dark Ages, right? Now, this is the time when the ancient Greek and Roman were almost forgotten. Okay, we will understand later what happened to that. Now, this was the time when the Western Roman Empire collapsed, that is in the 5th century. Okay? But then later on, we get to know that the Renaissance age emerged from the time after 1500, right, which will be 16th century. Now, this is a kind of, division or distribution of the time. Now, what is the old literature and what is the middle literature? So, Old English is the earliest writing in English, and that dates from the 17th century. On the other hand, the Middle English dates from 14th century, right? So, if we go back over here, the Middle English, also called Dark Ages, and somewhere between 450 to say 700, okay, or 800. Now, the earliest text in English language, in Old English language, is called Beowulf. It is a long poem, which is also called a heroic narrative poem of about 3000 lines. Now, if you can see on the screen and if you read or try to read these lines, probably you won't be able to make any sense out of it. Why? Because these lines have been written in Old English. Here is the modern version of these lines. So this word, I don't know what is it. This one is translated as so. Okay, and then it continues. We is translated as the, right? Now only right the experts of Old English can translate Old English into modern English. Okay, so this modern translation was done by Heaney. Just to give you an idea how much the Old English was different from the later contemporary English that we are aware of. So the characteristics of the Old English included blending of Christian and pagan ideas. So the Old English, or the literature of Old English, which was mostly poetry, that was about the ideas taken from Christianity and taken from paganism. Paganism, by paganism we mean uh, the idol worship, to be exact, right? So that initial literature was kind of obsessed with the Christian and pagan traditions. There was also a lot of emphasis on ritual, royal authority, and storytelling in those lines of poetry or in those poems which were written in Old English. But England's first great literary figure who was born in Middle Ages was Geoffrey Chaucer. Geoffrey Chaucer was, born approximately on 1343 and died in 1400. The poems that he wrote, the works that he produced, they are, the main work among them is called the Canterbury Tales, which is again an extensive poem, and of course, whole of that text is still available. Now, if you look at these lines, starting from full until here, you might be able to identify some of the words over here. For example, full brighter, okay, or was, or shining, right, or than. They might mean a little different from what we know as far as the meaning of these words are concerned, but still uh, their meaning is very close to the modern meaning. Then loud, right? As, yearn is past, right? So this is example of Middle English. So if you compare the Old English with the Middle English, you can see very clear transition from the Old English to the medieval English. Uh, Difference between Old English and the Middle English, right? Now, characteristics of Middle English literature. Earlier, I explained to you the characteristics of Old English literature, but this is Middle English literature. Now, the Middle English literature, in the Middle English, teaching you how to be good and how to avoid evil. Also, this literature had genre qualities. What do we mean by that? By that, we mean that the writers were very much aware of maintaining the characteristics of one particular genre while they were writing literature. So they knew, for example, that they were writing a fabulum, fable, so to say. Fable is a literary piece of work in which animals have human traits. Okay, so the was kind of sticking to certain genres of literature. Also, the Middle English was, sticking to narrative once again. That is, the poems were written in such a manner that you could trace whole narrative in them. And the last feature of uh, Middle English was that it was never mechanically reproduced. And of course, you know the reason. There was no printing press available at that time to mechanically reproduce or reprint the works which had been written once. And then we come to this period, which is called the early modern period after 1500, right? So we have the first period starting from 450, in which the major poet is Chaucer. We have in which the major poem is Beowulf. Then we have the second period recognized as Middle Ages, and in that the major poet is Chaucer, right? And then we have this third period, which is called the Renaissance or early modern period. It starts from 1500, ends at 1660. The word Renaissance means rebirth. Okay, this was the time when the printing press had been invented. Okay, now this is the time of the rebirth. What does that mean? That means this is the time when the Greek and Latin classics, they were kind of reclaimed, and people developed their interest in reading them once again. So it was kind of revival of classical knowledge that this particular age saw. So the invention of printing press meant that the knowledge could be disseminated to many people, and many people could get hold of the printed book, right, and read it. That was the reason, in fact, that the classical knowledge of Greek and Roman times that was disseminated so widely. This was the age when the astronomer Copernicus worked. This was the age when Galileo, the scientist, worked, the astronomer. And then, as I already said, this was the age of rediscovery of classical text, right? And that is why this age is called Renaissance or early modern. In the Renaissance time, the first modern English epic was written. Okay, epic is a poem of very large scope, containing a very long story in it. The title of that particular epic is The Fairy Queen, written by Edmund Spenser. Again, this was the time when King James Bible version was written. And then finally, many of you mentioned Shakespeare in your responses. That was the time when William Shakespeare wrote his works. Now, the characteristics of early modern literature included, there was in the literary works, there was lot of mentioning of discovery and exploration. And then there was a sense of anti-authoritarianism in the early modern literature. And that sense of anti-authoritarianism was against the institution of king. And this was the time when religion faced a lot of challenges, because the people who were reading the classical works of Greek and Roman time, they developed a kind of logical way to look at their society, and they tried to look at the church from the same logical and critical perspective. That posed challenge to the religious way of thinking. So to sum up, starting from 450, we can divide English literature into three, uh, slots of time, or time slots. The first one, which is called the Old English, the second one, which is called the Middle English or Middle Ages, and the third one, which is called Renaissance or early modern period, right? So in the Old English, we have Beowulf, the poem. You don't know the author. In the Middle English, we have Chaucer, right, who wrote Canterbury Tales. And then in the early modern Renaissance period, we have many authors. Okay, but the two which were famous were Edmund Spenser, who wrote Fairy Queen, and then William Shakespeare. You are aware of many works written by him, right? So this is the end of the lesson. If you have any questions, you can ask.